At my mother's Thanksgiving dinner in Millbrook, she placed a perfectly seared ribeye in front of each guest, the plates gleaming under her crystal chandelier. When she reached my 8-year-old son Mason, she set down a paper plate with cold meatloaf from 3 days ago and said, "He should be grateful for scraps. That's all mixed kids deserve." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood up slowly, picked up that paper plate, and said, "Perfect. Then you should be grateful when I never bring him here again." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was 28 years of buried racism finally crawling out of its hiding place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of rosemary and thyme still makes my stomach turn. It takes me right back to that dining room in my childhood home on Maple Ridge Drive, where my mother, Patricia Whitmore, had spent 3 days preparing what she called the perfect Thanksgiving feast. The mahogany table she'd inherited from her grandmother stretched beneath an antique lace tablecloth, set with the good china that only came out for special occasions. 14 place settings, each one precisely measured, each one representing a family member she deemed worthy of her best effort. Except for Mason's spot. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months, growing bolder since my divorce from Marcus became final. My mother had never approved of my marriage to a black man, though she'd learned to smile and nod in public. "What will people think?" she'd whispered when I first brought him home to Cedar Falls 7 years ago. But Marcus had won over my father, Richard, with his engineering degree and quiet confidence. Even my mother had eventually learned to tolerate him, especially when Mason was born with those striking hazel eyes and caramel skin that made strangers stop us on the street to tell us how beautiful our baby was. But tolerance isn't acceptance. And when Marcus and I separated last spring, an amicable split that had nothing to do with race and everything to do with growing apart, my mother saw an opportunity. "Now you can find someone appropriate," she'd said during one of our weekly phone calls. "Someone who understands our family values." I'd brushed it off then. Patricia Whitmore was 72, set in her ways, from a generation that whispered their prejudices instead of shouting them. I told myself she'd never hurt Mason directly. He was her grandson, after all. Half of me, half of her precious daughter who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern and worked as a pediatric nurse. Surely that counted for something. How naive I was. The morning of Thanksgiving, I dressed Mason in his best button-down shirt and tiny khakis. He was so excited to see his cousins, my sister Rebecca's twins, Connor and Blake, who were only a year older. "Mama, do you think Grandma made her famous apple pie?" he'd asked, bouncing in his car seat as we drove through the tree-lined streets of Millbrook, where every house looked like a magazine cover and every family looked exactly the same. "I'm sure she did, baby," I'd told him, adjusting his collar at the front door. "Remember to say please and thank you, okay?" My father opened the door with his usual warm smile, scooping Mason up in a bear hug that made my son giggle. "There's my favorite grandson," he boomed, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Rebecca appeared in the hallway with her boys, all of them in matching sweater vests that screamed, "Family Christmas card." Her husband David nodded politely, the same lukewarm greeting he'd given me since the divorce. But it was my mother's face that should have warned me. She emerged from the kitchen wearing her holiday apron, the one with tiny turkeys embroidered along the hem, and her smile faltered for just a second when she saw Mason. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but I'd been reading Patricia Whitmore's micro-expressions my entire life. "Hello, dear," she said, giving me a stiff hug before glancing down at Mason. "My, haven't you grown?" No warmth. No affection. Just the tone she'd use with a neighbor's child she was obligated to acknowledge. Dinner was called at exactly 4 o'clock, as it had been every Thanksgiving for as long as I could remember. We filed into the dining room like a well-rehearsed play, everyone taking their assigned seats. Mason climbed into the booster seat I'd brought from home, positioned between me and his grandfather, chattering excitedly about the decorations and the delicious smells. That's when I noticed the plates. Everyone else had received my mother's finest china, the delicate porcelain with hand-painted roses that she'd collected piece by piece during her marriage. Even the adults' wine glasses caught the light from the chandelier above, creating tiny rainbows on the cream-colored walls. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But in front of Mason sat a flimsy paper plate, the kind you'd buy for a child's birthday party. And on it, instead of the golden turkey and honey-glazed ham that graced every other plate, sat a cold slice of meatloaf and a scoop of instant mashed potatoes from a box. The same meatloaf I'd seen in her refrigerator 3 days ago when I'd stopped by to drop off a casserole dish. My blood turned to ice as I watched Mason's face change from excitement to confusion. His 8-year-old brain was trying to process why everyone else had a feast while he had this. Around the table, conversation continued as if nothing was wrong. Rebecca laughed at something David said. My father carved the turkey with ceremonial precision. My aunts and uncles chatted about holiday plans and work promotions. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did notice, and that was worse. That's when my mother leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper but loud enough for Mason to hear every word. He should be grateful for scraps. That's all mixed kids deserve. The world stopped turning. 28 years of swallowed insults, ignored comments, and forced smiles crystallized into that one moment. Every time she'd forgotten to include Marcus in family photos. Every backhanded compliment about Mason's hair texture or skin tone. Every pointed comment about certain neighborhoods and those people. All of it led to this, my mother serving my beautiful, innocent child literal leftovers while telling him he deserved nothing better because of the color of his skin. The paper plate trembled slightly in my hands as I stood, the conversation dying around the table like someone had turned off a radio. Mason looked up at me with those trusting hazel eyes, waiting for his mama to make sense of a world that had just told him he wasn't worth a real plate. I've never felt calmer in my life. Growing up in the Whitmore household was like living inside a perfectly curated museum where every piece had to match the collection. Our colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive wasn't just a house, it was a statement piece in Millbrook's most prestigious neighborhood, where property values and family pedigrees carried equal weight in casual conversation. My mother, Patricia Whitmore, ran our family like she was directing a Norman Rockwell painting. Every holiday had its traditions, every meal had its proper presentation, and every family member had their designated role in maintaining what she called our reputation. She was the queen of the Cedar Falls Country Club, head of the hospital auxiliary, and the kind of woman who could organize a charity gala while simultaneously judging every attendee's choice of silverware. Dad, Richard Whitmore, was the perfect supporting actor in her production. A retired bank president with silver hair and a golf handicap that impressed his peers, he learned early in their 45-year marriage that keeping Patricia happy meant keeping the peace. Your mother knows best, was his standard response to any family conflict, delivered with the same diplomatic smile he'd used to close million-dollar loans. My sister Rebecca had mastered the art of being Patricia's mirror image. 2 years older than me, she'd married David Thornton, a tax attorney whose family tree could be traced back to the Mayflower, and produced 2 blonde, blue-eyed boys who looked like they'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. Rebecca lived in a Georgian mansion 3 streets over, hosted book clubs for the right kind of women, and had never once questioned our mother's view of how the world should work. Then there was me, Sarah Whitmore Jackson, the family wild card who'd somehow veered off the predetermined path. I'd followed the script perfectly through college, earning my nursing degree from Northwestern and landing a position at Cedar Falls Children's Hospital. But then I met Marcus Jackson at a medical conference in Chicago, and everything my mother had planned for my life went sideways. Marcus was brilliant, funny, and happened to be the head of pediatric surgery at a hospital in Milwaukee. He was also black, which made him completely unsuitable in Patricia Whitmore's carefully constructed world. But what will people say? She'd whispered when I first brought him home for Christmas 7 years ago. She'd spent the entire evening calling him Martin and asking pointed questions about his background, as if his Harvard medical degree and spotless credentials weren't enough to earn basic respect. Dad had been different. Richard saw Marcus for what he was, a good man who loved his daughter, and had welcomed him with genuine warmth. But Patricia's disapproval hung over every family gathering like a storm cloud, creating tension that everyone felt but no one addressed. When Mason was born, I thought maybe love would bridge the gap. How could anyone look at my perfect baby and see anything but pure joy? For a while, it seemed to work. Patricia cooed over his baby pictures and bought him expensive toys for his first Christmas. She even bragged to her friends about her exotic grandson, as if his mixed heritage was some kind of fascinating conversation piece. But I should have noticed the subtle differences. How she always held him stiffly in photos, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. How she'd forget to invite Marcus to family functions, claiming she'd assumed I'd tell him. How she'd make comments about his hair being difficult or suggest I might want to do something about his skin tone in the summer. The signs were there. I just chose to ignore them because I desperately wanted to believe that my mother's love for me would extend to my son. Marcus had seen it more clearly than I did. She tolerates me because she has to, he'd said during one of our last arguments before the separation. But she's never going to accept Mason for who he is. You keep waiting for her to change, Sarah, but what if she never does? What if this is just who she is? I defended her then, making excuses about generational differences and ingrained prejudices that could be overcome with time and patience. I convinced myself that blood was thicker than bigotry, that family loyalty would eventually triumph over narrow-mindedness. The divorce proceedings had been amicable. Marcus and I had simply grown apart, our careers pulling us in different directions, our communication breaking down over months of missed dinners and scheduling conflicts. There was no drama, no infidelity, no bitter custody battle. We'd agreed to shared custody, with Mason spending weekdays with me in Cedar Falls and weekends with his father in Milwaukee. But Patricia saw the end of my marriage as vindication of her original concerns. "I'm not saying I told you so," she'd said over coffee the day after the papers were signed, "but mixed marriages have such a high failure rate. Maybe now you can find someone more compatible." Compatible. That was her favorite euphemism for white. The comments became more frequent after that. Little digs about Mason's behavior, suggestions that he needed more structure or better role models. She'd make observations about how urban his mannerisms were becoming, or wonder aloud if spending so much time with Marcus was confusing him about his identity. Rebecca never said anything directly, but I caught her exchanging meaningful looks with our mother during family dinners. David would change the subject whenever race came up in conversation, his discomfort palpable in the sudden silence that followed. Even my aunts and uncles seemed to have opinions about my situation, delivered in whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The Whitmore family had always prided itself on appearances. We looked perfect in Christmas photos, participated in all the right charity events, and maintained friendships with all the appropriate families in Cedar Falls. Patricia had built her entire identity around being the matriarch of a respectable family, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even her own grandson, threaten that carefully constructed image. But Mason was 8 years old and completely oblivious to the undercurrents of prejudice swirling around him. He loved his grandmother's house with its grand staircase and hidden nooks perfect for hide and seek. He adored his cousins and looked forward to family gatherings with the innocent excitement of a child who believed he was wanted everywhere he went. I'd spent months shielding him from the subtle slights and coded language, making excuses for his grandmother's coolness and his extended family's awkward silences. I told myself I was protecting him, giving him time to build confidence before he had to face the harsh realities of a world that might judge him by his appearance. What I was really doing was enabling a system that saw my beautiful boy as less than. The Thanksgiving invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written in Patricia's precise handwriting on cream-colored cardstock. Traditional family dinner at 4 p.m., it read. Please bring your famous green bean casserole. Looking forward to seeing you both. Both. As if Mason was an afterthought, included only because excluding him would raise uncomfortable questions. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have declined politely and started my own traditions with my son. But hope is a stubborn thing, and some part of me still believed that family meant unconditional love, that blood ties were stronger than prejudice. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. The pattern started when I was 12 and brought home my first report card with straight A's. While Rebecca got a family celebration dinner at Le Bernardin for her B+ average, I received a pat on the head and a reminder that academic achievement should be its own reward. Patricia had a way of making excellence feel ordinary when it came from me, while treating mediocrity as exceptional when it came from my sister. Rebecca was born to fulfill our mother's vision of the perfect daughter. Blonde hair that curled naturally, blue eyes that sparkled in photographs, and an intuitive understanding of social hierarchies that made her popular from kindergarten through college. She never questioned why certain families were invited to our parties while others weren't, never wondered why our country club had such a notably homogeneous membership, never challenged the unspoken rules that governed our insular world. I, on the other hand, had always been the question asker. Why did our housekeeper, Rosa, have to use the service entrance when everyone else came through the front door? Why did Patricia's voice change when she talked to the landscaping crew versus her book club friends? Why were there no black families at any of our social gatherings, despite Cedar Falls being nearly 30% African American? You think too much, Patricia would say whenever I raised these observations. Some things just are the way they are, Sarah. Not everything needs to be analyzed. But I couldn't help analyzing. Even as a child, I noticed how differently people were treated based on their appearance, their accents, their zip codes. I watched Patricia's face transform when she interacted with people she considered beneath her station, the mask-like smile, the slightly elevated tone, the way she'd position her body to signal that the conversation should be brief. By high school, I'd learned to navigate between two worlds, the one where I excelled academically and asked uncomfortable questions, and the one where I smiled politely at country club events and pretended not to notice the whispered comments about those people moving into our neighborhood. Rebecca never had to navigate anything. She was the golden child who dated the quarterback, got elected homecoming queen, and married her college sweetheart in a ceremony that made the society pages of 3 different newspapers. Her life unfolded exactly as Patricia had scripted it, each milestone celebrated with the enthusiasm of a director watching her masterpiece come to life. David Thornton represented everything Patricia valued in a son-in-law. His family owned a prestigious law firm that had been operating in Cedar Falls for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had been mayor. His mother chaired the Historical Society. His bloodline was documented, his reputation impeccable, his future predictable. When he proposed to Rebecca, Patricia spent 6 months planning a wedding that looked like something from a magazine, complete with ice sculptures and a string quartet. The twins, Connor and Blake, became Patricia's ultimate vindication. 2 perfectly blonde, perfectly behaved grandsons who looked like they'd stepped out of a J. Crew catalog. She documented their every achievement with the dedication of a professional photographer, creating elaborate scrapbooks that chronicled their little league victories, piano recitals, and academic awards. These boys are going to rule the world someday, she'd say, watching them play in her immaculate backyard. Look at that breeding. Look at those genes. That's what good family planning gets you. Good family planning. As if love was a business decision and children were investments in a portfolio. I tried to fit the mold. Through college, I dated appropriate boys with appropriate pedigrees and appropriate futures. I smiled at the right parties, laughed at the right jokes, and kept my increasingly progressive political views to myself during family dinners. I thought if I could just prove my loyalty to the family image, I'd earn the same unconditional acceptance that Rebecca enjoyed. Then I met Marcus at a pediatric cardiology conference in Chicago. He was presenting research on innovative surgical techniques for children with congenital heart defects, and his passion for his work was immediately apparent. During the coffee break, I approached him with a question about one of his case studies, and we ended up talking for 3 hours about everything from medical ethics to jazz music to our shared love of terrible superhero movies. Marcus had grown up in Detroit, the son of a high school principal and a social worker. He'd earned a full scholarship to University of Michigan, graduated summa cum laude, and completed his residency at Johns Hopkins. He was kind, brilliant, funny, and completely unimpressed by the social climbing that had defined my upbringing. "Your family sounds exhausting," he said after I'd described a typical Whitmore holiday gathering. "All that performance. When do you get to just be yourself?" It was the first time anyone had ever suggested that the constant code switching I did around my family might not be normal. When I brought Marcus home for the first time, I watched Patricia's face cycle through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, confusion, calculation, and finally, resignation. She was polite but distant, asking questions that sounded like small talk but felt like an interrogation. "And where did you say your family is from?" she'd asked over cocktails. "Detroit," Marcus had replied easily. "Oh, how urban," she'd said, as if the word itself explained everything she needed to know. Dad had been different. Richard saw Marcus's medical degree, his quiet confidence, his obvious devotion to me, and accepted him without reservation. They bonded over golf and shared war stories from their respective careers. Dad treated Marcus like the son he'd never had, which only seemed to irritate Patricia more. "Richard's always been too trusting," she'd confided to me after Marcus left that first visit. "He doesn't understand the complications this kind of relationship brings. Think about your children, Sarah. Think about what you're setting them up for." What she meant was, think about what you're setting me up for. Think about what the neighbors will say. Think about how this reflects on our family's carefully maintained image. I married Marcus anyway, in a small ceremony that Patricia attended with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling a tedious obligation. She smiled for the photographs but looked like she was attending a funeral rather than a wedding. The guest list was notably sparse on the Whitmore side. Many of our family friends had mysteriously conflicting commitments that weekend. When Mason was born 3 years later, I thought love might bridge the divide. How could anyone look at his perfect little face and see anything but pure joy? For the first few years, Patricia seemed to embrace her grandmother role, buying expensive toys and taking professional photographs to add to her collection. But there were always conditions to her love. Mason had to be perfectly behaved, impeccably dressed, and preferably photographed from angles that minimized his more obviously biracial features. She'd make comments about his hair being challenging, or suggest I might want to straighten it out for special occasions. She'd buy him clothes in colors that complemented his complexion better and suggest activities that might help him fit in with his cousins. Marcus saw through it immediately. "She's trying to whitewash him," he'd said after one particularly tense family gathering. "She wants him to exist in her world, but only if he can pass for something he's not." I defended her, making excuses about generational differences and gradual progress. I convinced myself that patience would eventually pay off, that exposure would cure prejudice, that family loyalty would triumph over bigotry. Even as the signs became more obvious. Even as her enthusiasm for Mason's achievements seemed forced compared to her genuine excitement over Connor and Blake's accomplishments. Even as she'd forget to include him in family photos or make comments about his behavior that she'd never make about his cousins. I kept believing, because the alternative was too painful to accept, that my mother's love came with conditions, and my son would never meet them. The first crack in my carefully constructed denial came during Mason's 6th birthday party. I'd planned what I thought would be the perfect celebration at Riverside Park: bouncy castle, face painting, and enough pizza to feed a small army. I'd invited all the cousins, of course, including Connor and Blake, who were 7 and thrilled to have someone closer to their age to play with. Patricia arrived 30 minutes late, carrying a small gift bag that looked like an afterthought compared to the elaborate presents she typically brought for the twins' birthdays. While other grandparents were taking pictures and cheering during the games, she sat at a picnic table checking her phone, occasionally glancing up with the expression of someone enduring a mildly unpleasant medical procedure. The breaking point came during present opening. Mason had unwrapped gift after gift with the uninhibited joy of a 6-year-old, thanking everyone with hugs and squeals of delight. When he got to Patricia's gift, a basic Lego set that cost maybe $20, he ran over to hug her with the same enthusiasm he'd shown everyone else. She patted his back awkwardly, like she was petting an unfamiliar dog, and said loud enough for several other parents to hear, "Well, I hope you'll actually play with this instead of just breaking things like you usually do." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Mason had never been particularly destructive, no more than any normal child, but Patricia had somehow catalogued every minor mishap and turned them into evidence of some fundamental character flaw. Meanwhile, Connor and Blake could demolish half her living room during a visit and she'd laugh it off as boys being boys. I watched my son's face fall, his excitement dimming as he processed the fact that his grandmother saw him as someone who broke things rather than someone who deserved beautiful gifts. Several other parents had overheard her comment, and I could see them exchanging glances, trying to understand why a grandmother would speak to her grandson that way. Marcus pulled me aside later that evening. "This has to stop, Sarah. He's starting to notice the difference in how she treats him versus the twins. Last week he asked me why Grandma Patty doesn't smile when she looks at him. I'd made more excuses then, explaining that Patricia was from a different generation, that she showed love differently, that maybe she was just having a bad day. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. My mother didn't just struggle to connect with Mason, she actively seemed to resent his existence. The incidents multiplied after Marcus and I separated. With him no longer around to witness Patricia's behavior, she became bolder in her differential treatment. During Connor and Blake's 8th birthday party, a lavish affair at the country club with a magician and a 3-tier cake, Mason sat at a separate table with the extra children, cousins from David's side of the family who weren't part of the inner circle. When Mason asked why he couldn't sit with Connor and Blake, Patricia had smiled sweetly and said, "The birthday table is for family, sweetie. You understand. Family." As if he weren't her flesh and blood, as if the genetic material that made up half his DNA somehow didn't count because it came filtered through me instead of through Rebecca. I'd moved him to my table, making light of it, but the damage was done. He spent the rest of the party quiet and withdrawn, watching his cousins from across the room like he was observing a life he could never quite join. The gift disparities became impossible to ignore. For Christmas that year, Connor and Blake each received tablets, new bicycles, and gift cards to every store in the mall. Mason got a sweater that was 2 sizes too small and a board game clearly marked as a clearance item. When I mentioned the discrepancy to Patricia privately, she'd looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "I treat all my grandchildren equally," she'd said, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she felt cornered. "If you're unhappy with what Mason received, perhaps you should have been more specific about what he wanted." As if I hadn't sent her the same detailed Christmas list I'd been providing for years. As if the problem was communication rather than deliberate choice. The summer before Mason turned 8, Patricia announced that she was taking Connor and Blake on a special grandmother-grandson trip to Disney World. 2 weeks of magic, she called it, complete with character breakfasts and behind-the-scenes tours. She'd been planning it for months, she explained, and couldn't wait to create special memories with her grandsons. "What about Mason?" I'd asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, well, you know, Sarah. Disney World is quite expensive, and with just the 2 boys, it's much more manageable. Maybe next year." Next year never came, of course. There was always a reason why Mason couldn't be included in the special adventures, the memorable experiences, the grandmother-grandchild bonding that she seemed to cherish with Connor and Blake. Too expensive, too complicated, too many people, not the right time. The photos from that Disney trip were everywhere: Patricia's Facebook page, the living room mantel, the refrigerator at Rebecca's house. Connor and Blake grinning with Mickey Mouse, eating ice cream shaped like mouse ears, posing in front of Cinderella's castle with their grandmother, who looked happier and more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. Mason saw the pictures during our next family dinner. He studied them carefully, his 8-year-old brain trying to process why his cousins got magical adventures while he got awkward hugs and criticism. "Why didn't I get to go to Disney World, Mama?" he asked on the drive home. I'd fumbled for an explanation that wouldn't crush his spirit or turn him against his grandmother. "Grandma Patty can only take so many people at once, baby. I'm sure she'll plan something special for you soon." But we both knew that wasn't true. Mason was learning, with the brutal clarity that children possess, that love in the Whitmore family came with conditions he could never meet. The breaking point should have come then. I should have drawn a line, established boundaries, protected my son from the psychological damage of conditional acceptance. Instead, I kept hoping things would change, kept making excuses, kept exposing Mason to environments where he was consistently treated as less than. I told myself I was being patient, that family relationships were complicated, that Patricia would eventually come around. What I was really doing was choosing my mother's comfort over my son's well-being, prioritizing keeping peace over protecting the person I loved most in the world. The Thanksgiving invitation arrived in mid-October, written in Patricia's careful script on expensive cardstock. "Traditional family dinner," it read, same as every year. I stared at it for a long time, weighing whether to accept or decline, whether to subject Mason to another gathering where he'd be subtly diminished and marginalized. Hope won over experience. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe Patricia was finally ready to embrace her grandson fully. Maybe the magic of the holiday would soften her heart and help her see Mason for the incredible child he was. I RSVP'd yes and bought Mason a new outfit, told him stories about Thanksgiving traditions, and built up his excitement for another family celebration. I was setting him up for heartbreak, though I didn't realize it yet. Some lessons can only be learned through pain, and I was about to get an education in the true cost of enabling prejudice in the name of family unity. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving felt different this year, charged with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite name. Patricia's phone calls became more frequent but somehow less warm, filled with pointed questions about Marcus's custody schedule and whether he'd be joining us for the holiday. "I assume it's just you and Mason this year," she'd asked during one of our weekly conversations, her voice carrying that particular tone of false casualness she used when fishing for information. "Yes, Marcus is spending Thanksgiving with his family in Detroit," I'd replied, not mentioning that this had been our arrangement for the past 2 years running. "Good," she'd said, then quickly corrected herself. "I mean, it's nice when we can have our family time without complications." Complications. That's what my son's father had become in her vocabulary, not a co-parent, not family, but a complication to be managed and ideally avoided. Rebecca's attitude had shifted too, becoming more pointed in her comments about Mason's behavior during family gatherings. During Connor and Blake's soccer game 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, she'd pulled me aside after Mason had cheered a little too enthusiastically for a goal. "Maybe you could work with him on indoor voices," she'd suggested, glancing around at the other parents. "He gets a bit excited sometimes, and it draws attention." The hypocrisy was staggering. Connor and Blake were notorious for their volume levels, frequently shushed by teachers and coaches for their boisterous commentary. But when they were loud, it was confidence and leadership. When Mason was loud, it was a behavioral problem that needed correction. I'd started noticing how the family conversations changed when Mason was in the room. Topics that flowed freely when only adults were present, discussions about school districts, vacation destinations, college plans, would suddenly become stilted and awkward when he joined us. It was as if his very presence reminded everyone of something they'd rather not acknowledge. The gift situation at Connor and Blake's birthday party in October had been particularly painful to witness. Patricia had presented the twins with matching mountain bikes, expensive models that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. The presentation was elaborate, complete with ribbons and a professional photographer she'd hired to capture the moment. Mason had watched from the sidelines, genuinely happy for his cousins but clearly wondering why his own birthday 3 months earlier had merited only a hastily wrapped clearance item. When one of the other children asked why Mason didn't get a bike too, Patricia had laughed it off with a comment about different families having different traditions. The social media posts from that party told their own story. Dozens of photos of Connor and Blake with their new bikes, professional shots of them posing with Patricia, candid moments of laughter and celebration. Mason appeared in exactly 3 photos, always in the background, always slightly out of focus, as if he were a photobomber rather than a family member. David's behavior had become more obvious too. Where he'd once made an effort to include Mason in conversations, now he seemed to actively avoid him. During family gatherings, he'd engage the twins in lengthy discussions about sports and school, but when Mason tried to join in, David would give polite but brief responses before turning his attention elsewhere. The message was clear: some grandchildren mattered more than others, some family members deserved investment while others were merely tolerated. I'd started dreading these gatherings, watching my son navigate the subtle rejection with the resilience of a child who was learning not to expect too much. He'd stopped asking why he couldn't sit with the twins at special events, stopped wondering aloud why his presents were different, stopped seeking the same level of attention from his grandmother that his cousins received effortlessly. The adaptation was heartbreaking to watch. My 8-year-old was already learning to make himself smaller, to expect less, to accept that his place in the family hierarchy was fundamentally different from his cousins. He was internalizing messages about his worth that would follow him for the rest of his life. Marcus had been calling more frequently, concerned about changes he was noticing in Mason's behavior during their weekend visits. "He seems sadder lately," he'd told me during one of our check-ins. More withdrawn. Last weekend he asked me if there was something wrong with him that made people not like him as much. The question had broken my heart, but I'd deflected it, making excuses about adjustment to the divorce, school stress, typical childhood phases. I couldn't bring myself to admit that my family was slowly but systematically teaching my son that he was less valuable than his white cousins. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Mason had come home from Rebecca's house unusually quiet. When I'd asked about his afternoon with his cousins, he'd shrugged and gone to his room without his usual detailed recap of their adventures. Later that evening, I'd found him looking through old family photos, studying pictures from holidays and celebrations with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. "Mama," he'd said finally, "why don't I look like everyone else in our family?" The question had been innocent enough, the kind of observation any mixed-race child might make. But there was something in his tone, a sadness, a sense of exclusion, that suggested he was beginning to understand that the difference in his appearance translated to a difference in how he was treated. I'd given him the speech I'd prepared for this moment, about how families come in all different combinations, how love was what mattered, how his unique heritage made him special. But even as I spoke the words, I could see that he'd already learned they weren't entirely true. Love in the Whitmore family did seem to have conditions, and his beautiful brown skin apparently violated those conditions. The Thanksgiving invitation sitting on my kitchen counter had felt like a test. Would this be the year Patricia finally embraced her grandson fully? Would the holiday spirit soften her heart and help her see past her own prejudices? Or would it be another occasion for subtle slights and differential treatment that chipped away at my son's self-worth? I'd chosen hope over experience, optimism over evidence. I'd dressed Mason in his best clothes, talked up the family gathering, and driven to Millbrook with the desperate belief that this time would be different. Some choices, I was about to learn, have consequences that reshape everything you thought you knew about the people you love. Some moments force you to choose between the family you were born into and the family you're responsible for protecting. That Thanksgiving dinner was about to become one of those moments, and I was walking into it completely unprepared for the choice I'd be forced to make. The air in Patricia's dining room felt thick with expectation as we gathered around the mahogany table, 14 family members taking their predetermined seats like actors in a well-rehearsed play. The crystal chandelier cast warm light over the autumn centerpiece, an elaborate arrangement of gourds, maple leaves, and cinnamon-scented candles that had probably taken hours to perfect. Everything looked like a magazine spread, which was exactly what Patricia intended. I helped Mason into his booster seat between my chair and Dad's, smoothing down his button-down shirt one last time. He was practically vibrating with excitement, chattering about the delicious smells and asking if he could have extra stuffing. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this gathering might actually live up to his expectations. "Grandpa Richard, did you see my loose tooth?" Mason announced proudly, wiggling his bottom front tooth for my father's inspection. Dad's face lit up with genuine delight. "Well, look at that. The tooth fairy's going to be very busy at your house soon. Make sure you put it under your pillow when it comes out." "I will." "Mama says the tooth fairy gives extra money for the first tooth," Mason replied, his gap-toothed grin making him look even younger than his 8 years. Patricia emerged from the kitchen carrying the first of what would be many trips worth of dishes, her movements precise and purposeful. She'd changed into her formal hostess dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, and had applied fresh lipstick for the meal. Everything about her screamed polished perfection, from her carefully styled silver hair to her spotless apron that somehow never actually got dirty despite hours of cooking. "Richard, would you help me serve the plates?" she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of orchestrated cheerfulness she used for family events. I watched Dad rise from his seat, kissing Mason's forehead as he passed. "Save room for pie, buddy. Your grandmother made 3 different kinds." The serving process began with Patricia's usual flair for presentation. Each plate was arranged like a work of art, thin slices of golden turkey fanned across fine china, honey glazed and glistening under the chandelier light, sides arranged in perfect proportions that complemented the hand-painted roses on the porcelain. I noticed the pattern immediately. Dad received his plate first, then Patricia served herself, followed by Rebecca and David. The twins were next, their plates prepared with slightly smaller portions but the same careful attention to presentation. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret, visiting from Springfield, received their servings with flourishes and compliments about their recent European vacation. Mason sat patiently, swinging his legs and humming softly to himself, completely unaware that he was being systematically overlooked. I felt my chest begin to tighten as the serving continued around the table, everyone receiving their holiday feast while my son waited trustingly for his turn. "This ham is absolutely divine, Patricia," Aunt Margaret gushed, taking her first bite. "You'll have to share the recipe." "It's a family secret," Patricia replied with that practiced laugh she reserved for compliments. "Passed down from my grandmother. Some traditions are worth preserving exactly as they were." Some traditions. The words carried more weight than they should have, loaded with implications about what, and who, was considered worth preserving in the Whitmore family legacy. Connor and Blake had already started eating, discussing their upcoming soccer tournament between bites. Rebecca was photographing her plate for Instagram, making sure the lighting captured the meal's perfection. David was explaining something about tax law to Uncle Thomas, their conversation punctuated by appreciative murmurs about the food. And still, Mason waited. I was about to speak up when Patricia finally approached our end of the table, carrying what I initially assumed would be Mason's plate. Instead, she walked past him entirely and served my father's younger brother, Uncle Henry, who'd been late arriving from his drive up from Springfield. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't saving Mason for last as some special gesture. She was deliberately ignoring him. I cleared my throat. "Mom, Mason hasn't been served yet." Patricia paused, as if she'd genuinely forgotten, though I could see the calculation in her eyes. "Oh, of course. I have something special for him." Something special. The words should have made me happy, but her tone carried an edge that made my stomach clench. I watched her return to the kitchen, emerging moments later with a paper plate, the kind used for children's birthday parties, decorated with cartoon turkeys that looked garish against the elegant table setting. But it wasn't just the plate that made my blood run cold. It was what was on it. While everyone else was enjoying Patricia's holiday masterpiece, perfectly seasoned turkey, glazed ham, herb stuffing, roasted vegetables that had been carefully timed to peak doneness, Mason's plate contained a single slice of cold meatloaf, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes from a box, and some canned green beans that looked like they'd been reheated in the microwave. The same meatloaf I'd seen in her refrigerator 3 days earlier when I'd stopped by to drop off a casserole dish. Leftovers that had been sitting there since Monday, now being served to my child while everyone else feasted. The contrast was so stark, so deliberately cruel, that for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. Around the table, conversation continued as if nothing was wrong. Rebecca was still photographing her meal. The twins were debating whether they preferred turkey or ham. Uncle Thomas was complimenting the wine selection. But Mason's face told the whole story. I watched him look at his paper plate, then at his cousin's china plates, then back at his own meal. His 8-year-old brain was working overtime to understand why everyone else had received a feast while he'd been given what looked like leftovers from a different meal entirely. The confusion in his eyes was heartbreaking, but it was the moment of understanding that followed that nearly broke me. I saw him glance around the table, noting the beautiful presentations everyone else had received, then look down at his sad little portion of reheated food on a disposable plate. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't an oversight or a mistake, it was intentional. That's when Patricia leaned over, her voice pitched just loud enough for Mason to hear every word but quiet enough that she could maintain plausible deniability with the rest of the family. He should be grateful for scraps. That's all mixed kids deserve. The words hit the air like a bomb going off in slow motion. Time seemed to stop as the full weight of what she'd said registered in my consciousness. Not just the words themselves, but the casual cruelty with which she delivered them, the matter-of-fact tone that suggested this was simply an accepted truth rather than a monstrous thing to say to a child. I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not angry, that would come later. Not shocked, part of me had been expecting something like this for years. Just still, like the moment before an earthquake when all the birds stop singing and the air itself seems to hold its breath. Around the table, the conversation faltered as people began to sense that something had shifted. forks paused halfway to mouths. The easy chatter about holiday plans and work updates died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to expand outward from where Mason and I sat. Patricia straightened up, her mask of hostess perfection still firmly in place, as if she hadn't just delivered a psychological blow to her 8-year-old grandson. She was already reaching for the wine bottle, preparing to move on as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just revealed the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath the surface of every family gathering for years. But this time, I wasn't going to let her move on. This time, I wasn't going to smooth things over or make excuses or pretend that what had just happened was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. The paper plate trembled slightly in my hands as I picked it up, the plastic fork nearly falling off the edge. For 28 years, I'd been making excuses for this woman. For 28 years, I'd been choosing family peace over my own values, swallowing my principles to maintain relationships that were built on conditions I'd never agreed to accept. But my son deserved better than scraps. He deserved better than paper plates and reheated leftovers while his cousins dined on china and holiday feasts. He deserved better than a grandmother who saw his beautiful brown skin as something that made him worth less than his white relatives. And I deserved better than a family that would sit silent while a child was being psychologically abused in the name of maintaining appearances. The words came out calm and clear, cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a blade. Perfect. Then you should be grateful when I never bring him here again. The silence that followed my words stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. 14 pairs of eyes stared at me as I stood behind Mason's chair, the offensive paper plate still trembling in my hands. The only sound was the soft hiss of Patricia's expensive candles and the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Mason looked up at me with those trusting hazel eyes, not fully understanding what had just happened but sensing that something fundamental had shifted. His small hand reached out to touch my arm, a gesture of comfort that nearly undid my carefully maintained composure. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the charged atmosphere. "We're leaving, baby," I said softly, setting the plate down with deliberate care. "Go get your jacket from the hall closet." He slipped from his booster seat without argument, perhaps sensing that this wasn't the time for questions. I watched him walk toward the hallway, his small figure moving past the frozen tableau of family members who seemed incapable of processing what they'd just witnessed. It was Dad who broke first. "Sarah, sweetheart, let's just... don't." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through his attempted intervention. "Don't you dare try to smooth this over, Dad. Not this time." Patricia finally found her voice, though it carried that particular tone of wounded innocence she'd perfected over decades of deflecting responsibility. "I don't know what you think you heard, but I was simply teaching your grandson that he's worth less than garbage." I turned to face her fully, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw something that might have been fear flicker across her features. "Because that's what you just did, Mom. You served every person at this table a beautiful holiday meal on your good china, and you gave my 8-year-old son leftovers on a paper plate while telling him he should be grateful for scraps because of his race." The word race hung in the air like a curse word. In the Whitmore family, we'd spent years dancing around the elephant in the room, using euphemisms and coded language to avoid acknowledging the ugly truth that had been poisoning our family dynamics for years. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her Instagram-perfect composure cracking slightly. "Sarah, you're being dramatic. Mom didn't mean. She meant exactly what she said." I looked around the table, taking in the faces of people I'd known my entire life. "And every single one of you is going to sit there and pretend you didn't hear it, just like you've been pretending not to notice the differential treatment for years." Uncle Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should all just take a breath in." "No." The finality in my voice surprised even me. "We're not taking a breath. We're not calming down. We're not going to pretend this didn't happen or that it's somehow my fault for overreacting to my mother telling my child he deserves scraps because he's mixed race." Connor and Blake sat frozen in their chairs, their young faces reflecting confusion and the beginning of understanding that their perfect family narrative was crumbling before their eyes. For the first time, they were witnessing a crack in the adult facade, seeing that the grown-ups they trusted weren't infallible. Patricia's mask was slipping, revealing something uglier underneath. How dare you speak to me that way in my own home? After everything I've done for this family, after all the sacrifices. What sacrifices? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean the sacrifice of tolerating your mixed-race grandson's existence? The sacrifice of occasionally having to acknowledge that your daughter married a black man? Those sacrifices? David was studying his plate with the intensity of someone trying to disappear into the china pattern. Aunt Margaret kept glancing toward the door as if calculating how quickly she could escape. The twins had stopped eating entirely, sensing that their safe, predictable world was shifting in ways they couldn't understand. You're being cruel, Sarah, Patricia said, her voice taking on that martyred tone she used whenever she was cornered. I've always treated Mason with love. Love? The word exploded from me with years of suppressed fury behind it. You call Disney trips for his cousins but not him love? You call expensive gifts for Connor and Blake and clearance items for Mason love? You call seating him at the extra table at birthday parties love? Mason appeared in the doorway with his jacket, his small face pale but determined. He'd heard enough to understand that this wasn't just about dinner anymore. This was about him, about his place in this family, about things he was too young to fully comprehend but old enough to feel in his bones. I walked over to him, kneeling down to his level. I need you to wait in the car for just 1 minute, okay? I'll be right there. He nodded solemnly, and I watched him walk toward the front door with a maturity that no 8-year-old should have to possess. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a starting pistol for the chaos that followed. You can't just leave like this, Rebecca said, finally finding her voice. We're family. Families work things out. Some things can't be worked out, I replied, turning back to face the room full of people who shared my DNA but apparently none of my values. Some things are deal breakers. This is about one comment, Patricia protested, her voice rising. One moment of frustration. You're destroying this family over one comment. One comment? I stared at her in disbelief. This isn't about one comment, Mom. This is about years of treating my son like a second-class family member. This is about teaching him that his worth is determined by his skin color. This is about every birthday party where he got less, every Christmas where his gifts were afterthoughts, every family gathering where he was tolerated instead of celebrated. Dad stood up slowly, his face gray with something that might have been shame. Sarah, your mother loves Mason. No, she doesn't. The words came out quiet but absolute. She tolerates him when she has to, and she resents him the rest of the time. And all of you have been enabling it because it's easier than confronting her racism. There it was, the word none of them wanted to hear, the truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. Racism wasn't something that happened in other families, other communities. It was right here at their Thanksgiving table, being served alongside the turkey and stuffing. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more final. I could see the mental gymnastics happening around the table as family members tried to process what I'd said, tried to reconcile their image of themselves as good people with the reality of what they'd just witnessed and ignored. Patricia's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a mottled red that suggested her blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. Get out, she said finally, her voice barely controlled. Get out of my house. Gladly. I grabbed my purse from where I'd set it on the sideboard, my movements sharp and decisive. But understand this, when you're ready to treat my son with the same love and respect you show Connor and Blake, you know where to find us. Until then, don't bother calling. I made it to the front door before Dad caught up with me, his hand gentle on my arm. Sweetheart, please. Don't let anger make decisions you'll regret. I turned to look at him, this man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. I'm not angry, Dad. I'm done. There's a difference. He searched my face, perhaps looking for the compliant daughter who'd spent decades keeping peace at any cost. But that woman had died somewhere between the paper plate and Patricia's casual cruelty, replaced by someone who finally understood that some bridges are meant to be burned. Take care of yourself, I said softly, kissing his cheek. Then I walked out into the November air, where my son was waiting in the car, and drove away from the only family I'd ever known. The rearview mirror showed Patricia's house growing smaller behind us, its warm windows and perfect facade hiding the ugly truth that had finally been exposed. I'd spent 28 years trying to fit my family into that perfect picture. It was time to create a new one. The 3 weeks following our dramatic exit from Patricia's house passed in a strange kind of limbo. Mason and I fell into new routines that didn't include weekly calls to Grandma Patty or Sunday dinners at the big house on Maple Ridge Drive. I waited for someone from my family to reach out, an apology, an explanation, even an angry demand that I stop being so stubborn. Instead, I got silence. The silence spoke volumes about how the Whitmore family handled conflict, by pretending it didn't exist until the offending party came crawling back with an apology. It was a strategy that had worked for decades, training family members to swallow their principles rather than risk exclusion from the inner circle. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't the one who needed to apologize. Mason asked about his grandmother exactly once during those first weeks. "Are we still mad at Grandma Patty?" he'd said while we were making hot chocolate on a particularly cold December evening. "We're not mad, baby," I'd replied carefully. "We're just taking some time to think about what happened." He'd nodded with the wisdom of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from adult explanations. "Okay. Can I have extra marshmallows?" The subject didn't come up again, which broke my heart in ways I wasn't prepared for. My 8-year-old had already learned to accept rejection as normal, to adjust his expectations downward rather than fight for the love he deserved. Marcus noticed the change during his next custody weekend. "He seems lighter somehow," he'd observed when dropping Mason off on Sunday evening. "Less anxious. What's going on?" I'd given him a abbreviated version of the Thanksgiving disaster, watching his face cycle through anger, vindication, and finally, relief. "I'm sorry it happened," he'd said, "but I'm glad you finally see what I've been seeing for years." That house was toxic for him. Work became my refuge during those weeks. At Cedar Falls Children's Hospital, I was surrounded by families who celebrated their children unconditionally, parents who would move mountains for their kids regardless of race, religion, or any other arbitrary category. It reminded me that love wasn't supposed to come with conditions, that the treatment Mason had endured wasn't normal or acceptable. Then, on a Tuesday evening in mid-December, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Sarah Jackson?" The voice was young, nervous, unfamiliar. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Keisha Williams. I think your mother did something terrible to my family." The words sent a chill down my spine. I stepped away from Mason, who was doing homework at the kitchen table, and moved into the living room where I could speak privately. "What do you mean?" "I'm a nursing student at Cedar Falls Community College," Keisha continued, her voice gaining strength. "Last month, I applied for a scholarship that your mother oversees, the Patricia Whitmore Excellence in Nursing Award. I had the highest GPA in my class, the best recommendations, everything. But when the winners were announced, I didn't even make the finalist list." My stomach began to sink. "Okay, but scholarships are competitive." "The girl who won had a 3.2 GPA, Keisha interrupted. "I have a 3.97. The difference is, she's white and I'm not." When I asked the department head about it, she seemed uncomfortable and told me to let it go. But then I started asking around, and I found out this isn't the first time. I sank into my armchair, phone pressed tight against my ear. "What do you mean?" "Your mother has been on that scholarship committee for 8 years. In 8 years, every single winner has been white. Every single one, despite the college being 40% minority students. The pattern is so obvious that some students have stopped applying because they know it's rigged." The room seemed to tilt around me. This was beyond family dynamics or generational prejudice. This was systematic discrimination affecting real people's lives, their educational opportunities, their futures. "Do you have documentation of this?" I asked. "I've been collecting information for weeks. Winners' names, their GPAs where I could find them, demographic data." I was planning to file a formal complaint with the college, but then someone told me about your mother's grandsons and suggested I might want to talk to family first. My blood ran cold. What about her grandsons? The woman who told me about the scholarship pattern, she works at Cedar Falls Academy where your nephews go to school. She said your mother has been making donations to ensure they get into advanced programs, even when their test scores don't qualify them. Apparently, she's been quite vocal about keeping the school's standards appropriately selective. Appropriately selective. The euphemisms never ended with Patricia, but the meaning was always crystal clear. Would you be willing to send me what you've collected? I asked, my mind racing. Are you going to help or are you going to protect your family? Keisha's question was direct, challenging. I'm going to help, I said without hesitation. Send me everything. The email arrived an hour later, and the contents were damning. Keisha had been thorough, 8 years of scholarship winners, all white, despite a diverse applicant pool. She'd included screenshots of social media posts where Patricia had made comments about maintaining standards and ensuring scholarships went to deserving young people from good families. But it was the information about Cedar Falls Academy that made my hands shake as I read. Patricia had been making significant donations to the school, donations that coincidentally preceded Connor and Blake's acceptance into gifted programs they weren't academically qualified for. The amounts were staggering, $20,000 here, $15,000 there, always timed perfectly to influence admissions decisions. She was literally buying her grandson's way into opportunities while simultaneously denying those same opportunities to more qualified minority students. My phone buzzed with another unknown number. Sarah? This is Janet Morrison. I got your number from Keisha Williams. I think we need to talk. Janet turned out to be a professor at Cedar Falls Community College who'd been quietly documenting the scholarship irregularities for years. When I agreed to meet her for coffee the next morning, she arrived with a manila folder thick with evidence. I've been trying to get someone to pay attention to this for 3 years, she said, sliding the folder across the table at Brewster's Cafe downtown. But Patricia Whitmore is a pillar of the community. She's on half the charity boards in town, friends with the college president, major donor to the hospital where you work. Nobody wants to rock that boat. I opened the folder and found myself staring at a systematic pattern of discrimination that went far beyond nursing scholarships. Patricia sat on committees for 3 different scholarship programs, all of which showed the same disturbing trends. She was also involved in admissions consulting for several private schools, helping guide families through the application process. Always, the guidance seemed to benefit white families while creating obstacles for minorities. There's more, Janet said quietly. I've been in touch with families who applied for scholarships and didn't get them despite being highly qualified. Some of them received feedback that was troubling. She showed me copies of rejection letters, including one that suggested a young black woman might be more comfortable at a school that better reflected her community background. Another recommended that a Hispanic student consider practical training programs, instead of pursuing a 4-year nursing degree. The language was carefully crafted to avoid obvious legal issues, but the message was unmistakable. These students weren't considered suitable for programs Patricia deemed prestigious. Why are you showing me this? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because you're her daughter, and rumor has it you two aren't on speaking terms right now. I'm hoping that means you might be willing to do what's right instead of what's comfortable. I thought about Mason, about the paper plate and the casual cruelty, about all the children whose futures had been limited by Patricia's prejudices. How many Keishas were out there, working twice as hard for half the recognition? How many families had been denied opportunities because Patricia Whitmore decided they weren't the right kind of people? What do you need from me? I asked. Janet smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. Everything you can tell us about how she operates. Every conversation, every comment, every insight into her mindset. We're building a case, but we need someone who understands how she thinks. I looked at the folder full of evidence, at the documentation of systematic discrimination carried out behind charity galas and community service awards. Patricia had used her position of power to engineer a world where people who looked like my son were systematically excluded from opportunities. She hadn't just hurt Mason, she'd hurt dozens of children and their families, crushing dreams and limiting futures based on nothing more than skin color. "I'll help," I said. "I'll tell you everything." For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Not just protecting my son, but protecting all the children who deserved better than Patricia Whitmore's version of appropriate standards. The reckoning was about to begin, and this time, I wouldn't be the one seeking forgiveness. The decision to go public wasn't made lightly. For 2 weeks after my meeting with Janet Morrison, I carried the weight of evidence like a stone in my chest: Patricia's scholarship manipulations, the systematic discrimination, the bought advantages for Connor and Blake. I found myself staring at my laptop screen during quiet evenings, cursor blinking on empty documents as I wrestled with what felt like the point of no return. Marcus noticed my distraction during one of our custody exchanges. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," he observed as Mason gathered his backpack for the weekend. "Something like that," I'd replied, not ready to explain the full scope of what I'd uncovered. How do you tell someone that your mother's racism extends far beyond family dynamics into systematically destroying opportunities for other people's children? The tipping point came on a snowy Thursday evening in January. I was helping Mason with his math homework when my phone rang with yet another unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Jackson? This is Maria Santos. I got your number from Professor Morrison. I hope you don't mind me calling." I stepped into the kitchen, leaving Mason to work on his addition problems. "Of course not. How can I help you?" "My daughter Elena applied for the Patricia Whitmore nursing scholarship last year," Maria said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "She had a 4.0 GPA, volunteer hours at the free clinic, recommendations from 3 professors. When she didn't even make the finalist list, I called to ask why." I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was going. "What did they tell you?" "That Elena might be happier at a school that better serves the Hispanic community. They suggested she consider becoming a medical assistant instead of pursuing a nursing degree, said it would be more realistic for someone with her background." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Here was another bright young woman, another family's hopes and dreams crushed by Patricia's systematic prejudice. Elena Santos, working toward a future in healthcare, told she should aim lower because of her ethnicity. Elena cried for 3 days, Maria continued. She started questioning whether she was smart enough, whether she belonged in nursing school at all. It took months for her self-confidence to recover. She's at State University now, doing well, but that rejection, it changed something in her. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the homework scattered across the table, thinking about Elena Santos and Keisha Williams and all the other young people whose futures had been derailed by one woman's belief that certain children deserved less. I thought about Mason, 8 years old and already learning to expect paper plates while his cousins got china. What would happen when he applied for colleges, scholarships, opportunities? Would he encounter other gatekeepers like Patricia, people who looked at his beautiful face and decided he wasn't worth investing in? That night, after Mason was asleep, I opened my laptop and began to type. The article started with Thanksgiving dinner, the paper plate, the leftovers, Patricia's whispered comment about mixed kids deserving scraps. But it didn't stop there. I detailed years of differential treatment, the systematic exclusion of my son from family traditions and affections. I wrote about the Disney trip for Connor and Blake but not Mason, the elaborate birthday celebrations versus the clearance gifts, the constant message that his worth was conditional on his ability to minimize the parts of himself that made Patricia uncomfortable. Then I expanded the scope. Using the documentation Janet and Keisha had provided, I outlined Patricia's pattern of scholarship discrimination. I included statistics: 8 years, dozens of qualified minority applicants, 0 winners who weren't white. I quoted rejection letters with their coded language about appropriate fit and realistic expectations. I wrote about the donations to Cedar Falls Academy, the carefully timed contributions that coincidentally preceded Connor and Blake's acceptance into programs they weren't qualified for. I detailed how Patricia had used her wealth and influence to buy opportunities for her white grandsons while systematically denying those same opportunities to more deserving minority students. The hardest part was writing about my own complicity. I forced myself to acknowledge the years I'd made excuses, the times I'd chosen family peace over my son's well-being, the countless moments when I could have spoken up but didn't. I wrote about the cost of enabling discrimination, how silence becomes participation, how family loyalty can become a tool of oppression. I titled it The Paper Plate: How Family Racism Became Systematic Discrimination. Before I could lose my nerve, I sent it to 3 local journalists I'd researched, reporters who'd covered education inequality and civil rights issues. I also sent it to the Cedar Falls Chronicle's opinion editor and posted it on Medium. Then I sat back and waited for my world to explode. The first response came within hours. Maya Rodriguez from the Chronicle called at 6 a.m., her voice crackling with the energy of a reporter who'd found something significant. "Mrs. Jackson, I read your piece. This is extraordinary. Are you willing to go on the record with all of this? Can you provide documentation?" By noon, Maya had interviewed Janet Morrison and Keisha Williams. By evening, she'd reached out to 3 other families affected by Patricia's scholarship decisions. The Chronicle ran the story on their front page the next morning, with the headline, "Local Philanthropist Accused of Systematic Discrimination." The response was immediate and explosive. Patricia's name was trending on local social media by 10 a.m. Cedar Falls Community College announced they were launching a full investigation into their scholarship processes. The hospital where I worked, where Patricia had served on the board for 15 years, issued a statement about their commitment to diversity and inclusion. My phone started ringing at 7 a.m. and didn't stop. Reporters wanting interviews, families sharing their own stories of Patricia's discrimination, community leaders expressing shock and outrage. By lunch, 3 different news stations had run segments on the story. But it was the personal messages that affected me most. Parents of minority students thanking me for speaking out. Young people who'd been told they weren't good enough for programs Patricia controlled, finally understanding that the problem wasn't their qualifications, it was systematic racism dressed up as philanthropic standards. Rebecca called me at 3 p.m., her voice shaking with fury. "How could you do this to our family? To Mom? She's been getting death threats, Sarah. Death threats. She's been destroying lives for years," I replied calmly. "Maybe it's time she faced some consequences. These are lies. Exaggerations. You're destroying her reputation over petty family squabbles." "Show me where I lied," I challenged. "Point to one inaccurate statement in that article." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca couldn't dispute the facts because the facts were undeniable. Dad called that evening, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The board at the hospital wants your mother to resign. The college has suspended her from all scholarship committees. Her bridge club asked her not to come to meetings anymore." "Good," I said simply. "Sarah, she's 72 years old. This could destroy her." "She destroyed herself, Dad. I just documented what she'd been doing. Can't you issue some kind of retraction? Say you were emotional, that you exaggerated?" "No." The word came out firm and final. "I won't lie to protect someone who's been systematically harming children for years. Not even for family." By the end of the week, Patricia had resigned from 4 different boards, lost her position at the college, and become a pariah in the community she'd once ruled. The investigation into scholarship discrimination had expanded beyond her committees, sparking a broader examination of inequality in local educational institutions. I should have felt guilty. Part of me expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the clear feeling of knowing I'd done the right thing, regardless of the cost. The truth was out there now, impossible to ignore or explain away. Patricia Whitmore's reign as a respected community leader was over, brought down by her own documented actions and the testimony of families she'd harmed. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I slept soundly through the night. The aftermath of the article's publication unfolded like a controlled demolition, each day bringing new revelations and consequences that rippled through Cedar Falls' tightly knit community. By the end of the first week, Patricia's carefully constructed world had crumbled so completely that even I was surprised by the scope of the destruction. The Cedar Falls Community College investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Within 72 hours of the Chronicle's initial report, the administration had uncovered evidence of irregularities dating back nearly a decade. Dr. Margaret Chen, the college president, held a press conference announcing that they were reviewing every scholarship decision Patricia had influenced and would be offering retroactive awards to qualified candidates who had been passed over. "We are deeply disturbed by these allegations and take our commitment to equal opportunity seriously," Dr. Chen announced to a room packed with reporters and affected families. "Any student who believes they were unfairly denied a scholarship opportunity will have their case reviewed by an independent committee." Keisha Williams was among the first to be awarded retroactive recognition, receiving not only the Patricia Whitmore Excellence in Nursing Award that should have been hers originally, but also a full scholarship to complete her remaining coursework. I watched her acceptance speech on the local news, tears streaming down my face as she spoke about nearly giving up on her dreams because she'd been told she wasn't good enough. But the college investigation was just the beginning. The state's Department of Education announced they were launching their own inquiry into scholarship discrimination at educational institutions across the region. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a file on systematic discrimination in educational funding. What had started as one family's story was becoming a catalyst for broader examination of institutional racism. Patricia's resignation letters began appearing in local newspapers like fallen dominoes. First the hospital board, where she'd served as chair of the diversity committee, an irony so bitter it made my stomach turn. Then the Historical Society, the Children's Literacy Foundation, and the Cedar Falls Women's Club. Each resignation was accompanied by carefully worded statements about stepping down to focus on family and pursuing other interests, but everyone knew the truth. The social consequences were perhaps even more devastating than the professional ones. Cedar Falls was a small enough community that reputation mattered tremendously, and Patricia's had been obliterated overnight. The country club where she'd lunched weekly for 40 years suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever she called for reservations. Her bridge club disbanded rather than face the awkwardness of her continued membership. Even her longtime housekeeper, Rosa, gave notice after 23 years of employment. Rebecca called me daily during those first 2 weeks, her voice alternating between fury and desperation. "She hasn't left the house in 6 days," she reported during one particularly heated conversation. "She's not eating, not sleeping. Dad's worried she's having a breakdown." "Maybe she should have thought about that before systematically discriminating against children for 8 years, I replied, surprised by my own lack of sympathy. "These people are vultures, Sarah. They're destroying a 72-year-old woman over mistakes." "These weren't mistakes," I interrupted. "Mistakes are accidental. This was deliberate, systematic, documented discrimination. And those vultures are families whose children Patricia hurt." The financial investigations began in week 3. The IRS announced they were reviewing the tax-exempt status of several organizations Patricia had been involved with, particularly focusing on whether scholarship funds had been distributed in accordance with their stated mission of promoting equal opportunity. The amounts involved were staggering, over $2 million in scholarship money potentially misallocated over the past decade. Cedar Falls Academy found itself in the spotlight when reporters discovered the timing of Patricia's donations coinciding with Connor and Blake's acceptance into advanced programs. The school's headmaster, Dr. William Thornfield, held a tense press conference defending their admissions process while announcing a comprehensive review of all recent decisions. "We categorically deny any impropriety in our admissions process," he insisted, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool February weather. "However, we take these allegations seriously and will conduct a thorough internal review." But the damage was done. Parents of rejected students were demanding explanations. The state education department was reviewing the school's accreditation. Most damaging of all, several teachers came forward anonymously to confirm that Connor and Blake had indeed been admitted to programs despite failing to meet academic benchmarks. David and Rebecca's marriage began showing signs of strain under the scrutiny. The law firm where David worked was fielding uncomfortable questions about their association with the Whitmore family. Rebecca's carefully curated social media presence disappeared entirely as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. The twins themselves became collateral damage in ways that broke my heart despite everything. Connor and Blake were old enough to understand that something terrible had happened but too young to fully comprehend the scope of their grandmother's actions. They were removed from their advanced programs pending the academy's review, forced to face classmates and teachers who now questioned whether they'd earned their positions. Marcus brought Mason home from one of their weekends with a report that Connor had been in a fight at school. Another kid called his grandmother a racist. Mason had explained matter-of-factly. Connor said she wasn't, but then the other kid showed him something on his phone and Connor got really mad. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness hearing this. Justice was being served, but children were paying the price for their grandmother's choices. Connor and Blake were innocent victims of Patricia's actions, just as Mason had been, different victims, but victims nonetheless. The community response split along predictable lines. Longtime supporters of Patricia denounced the investigation as a witch hunt against a respected community leader. Letters to the editor described her as a generous philanthropist, being unfairly maligned by disgruntled families, looking for someone to blame for their children's failures. But these defenders found themselves increasingly outnumbered by voices supporting the investigation. Family after family came forward with their own stories of Patricia's discrimination. Teachers spoke about the coded language used in admissions meetings. Former scholarship recipients who were white expressed guilt and support for a more equitable process. The most powerful response came from an unexpected source: other wealthy white families in Cedar Falls who publicly committed to reforming the systems Patricia had corrupted. The Hendersons, whose daughter had benefited from one of Patricia's scholarships, returned the money and demanded a more transparent selection process. The Washingtons, longtime country club members, resigned in protest of Patricia's treatment while calling for the club to examine its own diversity practices. "We cannot stand by while institutional racism operates in our name," Jennifer Henderson wrote in a letter to the Chronicle. "Patricia Whitmore's actions do not represent our values, and we call on other community leaders to join us in creating genuinely equitable opportunities for all children." By the end of the month, Patricia had become a pariah even among her own social class. The very community that had once celebrated her philanthropy now treated her as a cautionary tale about the corruption of unchecked privilege. I received hundreds of messages during those weeks, some hateful, many supportive, all proof that the story had struck a nerve far beyond Cedar Falls. Parents from across the state shared similar experiences with gatekeepers who decided their children weren't worth investing in. Educators described the subtle and not-so-subtle ways racial bias influenced academic opportunities. But the message that stayed with me came from Elena Santos, the young woman whose dreams Patricia had tried to crush. "Thank you for giving me back my voice," she wrote. "I thought it was my fault, that I wasn't good enough. Now I know the system was rigged, and that changes everything. That's when I knew that every burned bridge, every destroyed relationship, every moment of family drama had been worth it." Elena Santos would never again doubt her worth because of someone else's prejudice. Neither would Keisha Williams, or the dozens of other young people who'd been told they weren't good enough when the truth was that the system wasn't fair enough. The reckoning was far from over, but the silence had been broken. And in that breaking, something better was finally beginning to grow. 6 months later, I sat in my car outside Cedar Falls Elementary School, watching Mason run across the playground with a group of friends who saw nothing but a funny, smart kid who was great at kickball and could draw amazing dinosaurs. The late spring sunshine caught the highlights in his hair as he laughed at something his friend Jake had said, his whole face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. This was what normal looked like, a child who didn't have to question his worth based on the color of his skin, who didn't expect to receive leftovers while others got the feast. In the months since our family imploded, Mason had bloomed in ways I hadn't even realized he'd been withering before. "Mama, did you see me score that goal?" he called out as he bounded toward the car, his backpack bouncing with each step. "I saw it, superstar." "That was an amazing kick," I replied, ruffling his hair as he climbed into the back seat. "Jake said I should try out for the travel soccer team next year. Do you think I'm good enough?" The question would have broken my heart 6 months ago, that reflexive uncertainty about whether he deserved good things. But now there was confidence in his voice, genuine excitement about possibilities rather than preemptive disappointment. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," I told him, and watched his grin widen in the rearview mirror. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been therapy sessions to help Mason process what had happened at Thanksgiving, conversations about racism that no 8-year-old should have to have, and my own struggle to rebuild my sense of family and belonging. But slowly, steadily, we'd created something new and healthier from the wreckage of what came before. The broader community transformation had been more dramatic than I'd ever imagined possible. The scholarship discrimination investigation had expanded to encompass institutions across 3 counties, resulting in policy changes, personnel replacements, and millions of dollars in retroactive awards to students who'd been passed over. Cedar Falls Community College had implemented blind review processes for all scholarships, with diversity committees overseeing every decision. Keisha Williams had graduated with honors and was now working as a pediatric nurse at the same hospital where I worked. We'd become friends, real friends, not just allies in a cause, and she often stopped by my unit to check on the babies in our NICU. Watching her gentle confidence with the tiny patients, I thought about how close the medical field had come to losing her brilliance because one woman decided she wasn't worthy of investment. Elena Santos had transferred to Cedar Falls Community College and was excelling in their nursing program, having received the retroactive scholarship that should have been hers originally. She'd started a support group for minority students in healthcare programs, creating the kind of community and encouragement that institutional racism had tried to deny them. The ripple effects continued to spread. Cedar Falls Academy had been forced to implement need-blind admissions and transparent criteria for all programs. Connor and Blake had been allowed to remain in their advanced classes after demonstrating they could meet the requirements with appropriate support, but the school's culture had shifted dramatically. Parents could no longer buy their children's way into programs, and qualified students of all backgrounds were finally getting the opportunities they deserved. Patricia herself had become a different kind of cautionary tale. The financial investigations had revealed tax irregularities that resulted in significant penalties and the revocation of her involvement with any tax-exempt organizations. Her health had declined under the stress, leading to what Dad euphemistically called a period of rest that everyone understood meant a mental health crisis. I'd felt a complicated mix of emotions watching my mother's world collapse. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also genuine sadness for the woman who'd raised me, even if I could no longer recognize her in the person who'd served my son leftovers while telling him he deserved scraps. Rebecca had filed for divorce from David 3 months after the scandal broke. The pressure of public scrutiny and financial stress had exposed cracks in their marriage that had been hidden beneath social expectations and family loyalty. She'd moved back into Patricia's house, 2 broken women trying to salvage something from the ruins of their perfect lives. Dad had called me twice since Thanksgiving. The first time, in February, he'd tried to broker some kind of reconciliation. "Your mother's learned her lesson," he'd said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She knows she made mistakes. Isn't that enough?" "Dad," I'd replied gently, "she didn't make mistakes. She systematically discriminated against children for years. And she told my 8-year-old son he deserved scraps because of his race. That's not a mistake, that's who she chose to be." The second call had come just last week. This time, his voice carried a different quality, resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "I wanted you to know that your mother and I are separating," he'd said without preamble. "I'm moving to the cottage in Wisconsin. I can't pretend anymore that what she did was acceptable." The cottage had been their retirement dream, a small place on a lake where they'd planned to spend their golden years. Now it would be Dad's refuge from a marriage built on foundations that had cracked beyond repair. "I'm sorry, Dad," I'd said, and meant it. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "What I wanted was a family that loved unconditionally," he'd replied. "What I had was a family that loved conditionally, and I was too afraid of conflict to demand better. I'm 70 years old, Sarah. It's time I stopped enabling behavior I don't believe in." He'd asked about seeing Mason, and I'd said yes. Richard Whitmore had never been the problem. He'd been weak, conflict-averse, too willing to keep peace at any cost, but he'd never been cruel. Mason deserved to know his grandfather, and Dad deserved the chance to be better than he'd been. The professional consequences had been almost as dramatic as the personal ones. I'd been promoted to charge nurse in the NICU, partly because my supervisor admired my courage in speaking truth to power, as she'd put it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Standing up to my mother's racism had advanced my career in ways that years of excellent performance hadn't. Marcus and I had grown closer through the ordeal, our co-parenting relationship strengthened by shared commitment to protecting Mason from further harm. He'd been vindicated in his long-standing concerns about Patricia's treatment, but he'd taken no pleasure in being right about something so painful. "You did the hardest thing," he'd told me during one of our coffee meetings to discuss Mason's schedule. "You chose your child over your comfort. That's what real love looks like." The letters still came, sometimes angry messages from Patricia's remaining defenders, but more often gratitude from families who'd been helped by the investigations my article had triggered. Parents whose children had received retroactive scholarships, students who'd been admitted to programs they'd been unfairly denied, educators who felt empowered to challenge discriminatory practices they'd witnessed but been afraid to report. But the letter that meant the most had come from an unexpected source, Connor. At 9 years old, he'd written in careful cursive to apologize for his grandmother's treatment of Mason and to ask if they could still be cousins, even if their families weren't talking anymore. I'd shown the letter to Mason, who'd immediately wanted to write back. Their correspondence had led to occasional playdates supervised by me and Marcus, opportunities for the boys to maintain their relationship outside the toxic dynamics that had surrounded them. Connor was a good kid who'd been caught up in a system he was too young to understand, just like Mason had been. They both deserved better than to lose each other because of adult failures. As I pulled into our driveway that evening, I thought about the cost of truth-telling. I'd lost my mother, my sister, most of my extended family, and the social network I'd known my entire life. The holidays were quieter now, our celebrations smaller but somehow more authentic. But I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that my son would never again doubt his worth because of someone else's prejudice. He would grow up knowing that love doesn't come with conditions, that he deserves every opportunity his talents can earn him, that his beautiful mixed-race identity is something to celebrate rather than something to minimize. In the kitchen, Mason pulled out his homework while I started dinner. "Mama," he said without looking up from his math worksheet, "Jake's mom invited me to his birthday party next weekend. It's at the laser tag place. Can I go?" "Of course, baby. That sounds like fun." "Good," he said with satisfaction. "I'm going to beat everyone at laser tag." The confidence in his voice, the assumption that he belonged, that he deserved fun experiences, that other parents would welcome him warmly, was everything I'd fought for. He no longer questioned whether he was worthy of good things. He simply expected them, the way every child should. Some bridges are meant to be burned when the foundation beneath them is rotten. Some families are worth fighting for, and some families are worth fighting against. Some silences must be broken, even when the breaking destroys everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. That night, as I tucked Mason into bed, he wrapped his arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you, Mama. Thank you for taking care of me." "Always, baby," I whispered back. "Always." And in that moment, surrounded by the peace that comes from choosing love over comfort and truth over convenience, I knew I'd made the right choice. Some stories end when you stop editing them to please people who were never worthy of the performance. If you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right, tell me, what did it cost you, and what did you gain? Because sometimes the most expensive thing you can do is stay silent, and sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is speak the truth, even when your voice shakes and your heart breaks and everyone you've ever loved tells you to be quiet. The truth has its own power. And love, real love, never asks you to make yourself or your children smaller to make other people comfortable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.